Hello, everyone. I'm here to discuss my book, Opposing the Imam, The Legacy of the Nawasib in Islamic Literature, and why this book matters. My name is Nebil Husayn. I'll try to present some background, a brief sketch of what you'll find in each chapter, and finally, 8 key lessons that a person can take away from reading this book. So the key figure at the center of this work is the fourth caliph in Islamic history, a man named Ali, the son of Abu Talib. He was the close kinsman of the Prophet, who married Muhammad's daughter Fatima and thus became the father of all of the Prophet's grandchildren. He's revered for his wisdom, his swordsmanship, his piety, and he almost needs no introduction. He's assassinated in 660 of the Common Era after 4 turbulent years as caliph. Ali is at the center of Shi'i Islam, and he's recognized as the rightful and natural successor of the Prophet Muhammad for Shi'i Muslims. Hence, I refer to him as the Imam in the title of my book. He's the first of many Imams in Shi'i Islam, revered for their piety and virtue. In this work, I wanted to understand the ways in which authors grappled with Ali's life without having the knee-jerk tendency to make this a study of Shi'i Islam. Instead, we see how Muslims from other well-known sects or schools of thought grappled with Ali's life, and we see how they wrote in ways that indicate they were aware of Shi'i views of Ali, and that they tried to forge alternative ways of understanding his life. As a result, this book provides context and a space to understand the tensions, the stories, and the evolution of understandings about Ali and his sons in non-Shi'i settings. In the introduction, I situate the reader so everyone comes to see our first key lesson, namely that there was once a time in early Islamic history where this revered saint and caliph was once hated by thousands of Muslims. He was not the fourth rightly guided caliph. Rather, there had been 3 rightly guided caliphs in the views of these Muslims. Ali was not one of them. When Ali claimed the caliphate, people who believed this rose up and fought against him and his supporters. When Ali is assassinated after 4 years of civil wars and the Umayyads come to power, there are people in that time who view history with the following lenses. The caliphs were Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and then there was a period of 4 years of civil war and tumult in which there's no caliph, and then Muawiyah becomes the 4th legitimate ruler of the Muslim Empire. This book is an extended reflection on how and why that could be the case. Why did people view the history of the caliphs this way? What did these Muslims believe about Ali? How did they respond when those Muslims who loved Ali said, wait, but Ali was a righteous person, how can you say this when he did X, Y, or Z, or the Prophet said A, B, and C about him? I interrogate the literature, and I dig and I excavate to see how the opposition to Ali viewed him and responded to his admirers, hence the title, Opposing the Imam. So, in chapter 1, entitled Ali, A Contested Legacy, I introduce the reader to our second key lesson, that there was a wide spectrum of ways in which Muslims viewed Ali. I divide them into 6 groups. The first group is made up of Muslims who are zealously anti-Ali. Now, the descendants of Ali are known as Alids. So generally, this group consisted of people who were also anti-Alid. Anti-Alids in Arabic were known as Nawāṣib. Because the Nawāṣib did not crystallize into an enduring sect, representing the views of, say, Ali's rivals like the Umayyads, the legacy of the Nawasib has been overlooked in academic studies of Islamic history and literature. I set out to examine this group, and so I give my book the subtitle, The Legacy of the Nawasib in Islamic Literature. If you were to ask me to pinpoint the key creed of Nawasib, it would be their tendency to publicly condemn Ali, his sons, and his partisans as evil. In the early Muslim community, those who did this were largely part of one of 3 main political blocs. First, there were the Uthmaniyya, and so these Uthmanis are zealous supporters of the first 3 caliphs. Second, there were supporters of the Umayyad dynasty, and this was the family who positioned themselves as rivals to Ali's family, the Hashemids. And third, there was a Khariji faction, an independent group of militant extremists who had a tendency towards sectarianism, condemning those who are not part of their inner circle as guilty of unbelief and as non-Muslims. As we move along the spectrum to our second group, we see how its members do not condemn Ali outright. but oppose any special veneration of him. They tend to say, he was a fallible person, he may have committed blunders, he may have harmed the Muslim community when he became caliph. But many early members of this group were silent on whether or not he intentionally chose to do that. Rather, they raised doubts on whether Ali became a legitimate caliph unintentionally. This is in contrast to group one, which consisted of those who explicitly condemned the person of Ali as an evil person, while the second group said, well, he was liable to making mistakes. The third group became the orthodox position of Sunnism. Ali is accepted as the fourth rightly guided caliph. The fourth group regarded him as the greatest Muslim after the Prophet. This is a doctrine known as Tafdeel Ali. And they held that Ali was the wisest and most meritorious Muslim after the Prophet Muhammad. But they didn't go so far as to say that Muhammad explicitly designated him as his successor. The fifth group became the orthodox position of Shiism. Ali was the rightful heir to the Prophet's authority, selected by God or the Prophet before Muhammad's death. The sixth group was made up of Wulat, or Shi'is that viewed Ali as a manifestation of God. In this circle, stories about Ali's miraculous power over the universe and his omniscience was a common motif. Now, before I turn to the case studies that make up the rest of my book, I want to bracket the question of historicity. Scholars engaged in the academic study of Islam have participated in a vigorous debate on how much we can rely on Islamic literature, or history writing in particular, as representative of actual history. Rather than engage in such debates, I say let's take a deep dive into understanding what the literature says. Let us understand the ways in which these authors and their sub-communities remember the past, rather than speculate to the extent to which their words are true or false. In this way, this becomes a study of early Islamic literature and theology. I want us not to only consider the negative portrayals of Ali, but also portrayals of early Muslims that were companions of the Prophet as despising him as part of our shared heritage or memories of the past, whether or not you consider such texts as accurately representing history. In chapter 2, I examine the ways in which historians and hadith scholars depicted Umayyads and Uthmanis. And Uthmanis, one can remember as the pro-3 caliph camp, as opposing Ali and their arguments about him. This includes individuals who are revered as companions in Sunni Islam. Again, leaving debates about historicity aside, the key objective is to find and showcase this literature, which has been largely overlooked, despite the influence that these two factions had on later Sunni thought. A commitment to the belief in the righteousness of companions played an important role in the reception of anti-Alid hadith in Sunni Islam. It created an incentive for scholars to reject or charitably reinterpret not only texts that disparaged Ali, but also those that portrayed other companions as despising him. Sunnism in the end began to argue that we can't trust any of this literature depicting companions behaving badly. This study leads us to our third lesson. Anti-Ali sentiment has come to possess a, quote, erased history. Not only has it disappeared so that this culture no longer exists, but there's a denial that it had ever existed to begin with. I've seen Sunni polemicists now argue that the Umayyads never cursed Ali from the pulpits, which seems quite unlikely since historians and hadith transmitters note that they did this for decades and in multiple cities. In chapter 3, I consider the ways in which the pro-Ali and anti-Ali arguments play out among Mu'tazili thinkers, who are famous dialectical theologians on both sides of the aisle. One of the most famous polemicists to ever write a treatise representing the pro-3 caliph camp was the Iraqi Mu'tazili theologian Amr ibn Bahr al-Jahir. He was active in the 8th and 9th centuries, dying in 255 Hijri or 869 of the Common Era. His treatise is a great one to dissect for two reasons. First, he lived in a period in which anti-Alid sentiment still ran high in various parts of the Muslim world. If in the previous chapter we relied on oral history or secondary sources or intermediaries to understand anti-Alids, this is our closest thing to a surviving primary source text an extended treatise from an anti-Alid writing with his own pen about why he rejects rational arguments and hadith that attempt to exalt Ali. Second, al-Jahid's treatise triggered a number of rebuttals from authors who condemned him as anti-Alid. But when you read the chapter, you see that Jahid was a polemical genius in his own right. He refuses to be pinned down as a simple anti-Alid. And in other treatises, he provides nuance. I argue that he writes this treatise as a takedown of Shiism, his Risalat al-Uthmaniyya, and the doctrine that Ali was the natural successor of the Prophet. But elsewhere, in support of Zaydism, explains why someone could arguably support Ali as the best of all of the Prophet's disciples. And we even see Jahid use all of his dialectical tools to defend Ali's conduct as caliph from those who wish to criticize it, again in another treatise. By studying the work of Jahid and another famous Sunni scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah, we discover our fourth key lesson, that we can find later scholars who on paper, as part of their creed, will say that Ali became caliph and that he was the legitimate ruler of the Muslim community. Nonetheless, in an effort to discredit Shiism, will write polemical texts that rely on arguments that were first argued by those who opposed Ali's caliphate, meaning those who are along the spectrum of group 1 through 6. They were part of group 1, the Nawāṣib, or those early Muslims who espoused opposition to the special veneration of Ali, meaning group 2. This allowed anti-Alids of the first 2 centuries to continue to have an enduring legacy because these later scholars like Al-Jahid or Ibn Taymiyyah would sometimes rely on their arguments. So again, long after the disappearance of the Nawasib and long after their explicitly anti-Alid doctrines had lost favor, their views continued to find sympathy when scholars became hyper-partisan or sectarian. And so in chapter 4, I discussed the literary heritage of one of the least discussed sects or schools in Islamic history, the Ibadis or Ibadism. In agreement with the early Khawarij, the Ibadis portrayed Ali as having been a righteous Muslim and a legitimate caliph until the end of the Battle of Siffin. At that point, they believe he became misguided in his quest for power. This image of Ali differs from the Uthmani and Umayyad portrayals of him as this vicious or sinful person throughout his entire life. This chapter draws primarily on the Kitab al-Dalil by Abu Yaqub al-Warjalani, who was active in the 12th century, dying in 570 Hijri or 1175 of the Common Era. And he was an influential Ibadi scholar of North Africa. I complement his citations of expositions on Ali by citing the anti-Alid views expressed by influential thinkers in other authoritative Ibadi historical works. These texts demonstrate that the Khariji legacy of anti-Alidism, like the Umayyads and the Uthmanis, partially survives even in the contemporary world. So lesson number 5 is something that I draw from this chapter. With some digging, we can find Muslims who condemned the Prophet's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, as misguided for their association with Ali's political career and their support for him. It's in Ibadi literature that we also find a few cases where Muslims praised Abdurrahman ibn Muljam, the infamous assassin of Ali, who stabs and mortally injures Ali when he's leading the early morning prayers at a mosque. And it's in his praise that we see that he's described as someone who righteously rid the world of a tyrant and that he would be rewarded by God. Although I should note, to be fair, Ibadis as a school were ambivalent about Ibn Muljam. Usually he was neither condemned nor praised. I argue that this was due to the ambiguity that existed among Ibadis on whether Ibn Muljam could be considered a pious predecessor of the Ibadis or if he represented some other Khariji school that Ibadis condemned as extremist. So chapter 5 then examines the writings of the highly influential Sunni scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who was active in the 13th and 14th centuries, dying in 728 Hijri or 1328 of the Common Era. Because we live in this current moment in history where conservative Hanbali and Salafi thought has become the culture of a very prominent and globalized movement of Islam, and how Muslims practice. Ibn Taymiyyah is a scholar you can name drop, and he'll have great name recognition even among lay persons who may never have read his work. It's with that knowledge and cultural background that I take great care to do two things with my study of Ibn Taymiyyah. First, I try to provide some background to his life and his historical environment. Since chronologically, he's the last of our authors to have lived in history, we're better equipped to understand the context in which he wrote and the dynamics that may have led him to write one of the longest and most comprehensive refutations of Shia Islam ever written, his Minhaj al-Sunna and Nabawiyya. Second, given his prominence and a prevailing culture that accepts his authority, unquestioningly in some cases, I felt compelled to present his arguments as part of a dialectic. Rather than provide you with Ibn Taymiyyah's views on its own, as a standalone case study, I also include the pro-Ali position that he's responding to and carefully consider the different strategies he uses to reject those positions. Otherwise, we wouldn't fully understand the debate that's happening. I would say the extended examination of Ibn Taymiyyah's arguments helps one to better understand how and why some of his detractors accused him of advocating anti-Ali doctrines. I leave it to readers to judge the evidence for themselves on whether or not Ibn Taymiyyah writes in ways that denigrates Ali. And I ask readers to do this not only in the chapter dedicated to Ibn Taymiyyah, but also in an appendix where I translate relevant passages of the Minhaj al-Sunnah. Ibn Taymiyyah's criticisms of the political careers of Ali and also his son Husayn, and the defense of the political careers of their antagonists illuminate the tension that some Sunnis and their predecessors, such as al-Jahif, faced in opposing Shiism while simultaneously trying to reject anti-Ali sentiments as heretical. So lesson number 6 would be that Ibn Taymiyyah made pronouncements about Ali and the household of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, that other Sunni Muslims, let alone Shi'i Muslims, considered blasphemous and anti-Ali. I gather these passages and ask the reader to consider the evidence. In chapter 6, I do a deep dive into the processes that facilitated in the rehabilitation of Ali's tarnished reputation in Sunni Islam. Specifically, I turn my attention to hadith literature and how transmitters and compilers used techniques to forge an image of Ali that suited orthodoxy. This included the identification and flat-out rejection of the authenticity of anti-Ali reports. The easiest way one did this was through ad hominem attacks or criticisms of the transmitters of a report. What qualified as anti-Ali or Nawāṣib depended on the eye of the beholder. Some hadith were easy to spot. For example, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Juzajani narrated that he heard an Umayyad prince explain that the Prophet described Ali as the Qarun rather than the Harun of the Ummah or of the community, meaning Ali was like the biblical Korah, an antagonist to Moses rather than Aaron, the brother of Moses and his helper. While Juzajani was a respected scholar in the hadith community, for example, he narrates a hadith that appears in the collection of Bukhari, this report was roundly rejected as it was clearly a counter-report to the famous one accepted by most Muslim scholars. The second technique that hadith scholars and perhaps transmitters used was deflection. In some cases, the hadith or historical report in question couldn't be fully rejected because it referred to an incident that most people believed to be true. Here we have to deal with the history where even when this incident did happen, we see how Ali's antagonists would ascribe blame to him as generations passed, and the ways in which Sunnis attempted to move away from such claims. And so the details were amended so that culpability in a crime would be deflected away from Ali to someone else. To draw on one example, in the Prophet's lifetime, there's an incident where a wife of his is falsely accused of infidelity. This distresses the Prophet and the wife in question, commonly understood in Sunni Islam to be Aisha, and this causes a public scandal. According to Umayyad princes who narrated the tale, Ali was the culprit in spreading this slander. Although Sunni canonical reports acknowledge that Umayyads claimed this, The narratives deflect blame away from Ali to other unnamed hypocrites in the community and sometimes some Madinese personalities. In the book, I discuss a few more techniques copyists and compilers of hadith collections used to edit texts that they transmitted. But the last one I'll consider with you today in this brief review is deletions or erasure, meaning they were occasionally compelled to delete components of a report that were offensive to their sensibilities. And we see this by the tendency to amend those hadith to obfuscate the identities of companions who might be denigrated in the uncensored versions. For example, in one report, the second caliph, Umar bin Khattab, curses another companion, Samura ibn Jundab, for selling intoxicants during his caliphate. When the report appears in Sahih al-Bukhari, Umar says, "May God curse so-and-so or fulan," rather than "May God curse Samura," which is how we find the uncensored report with the exact same isnad or chain of transmitters in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. In the case of Ali, in other collections, we can see that he's portrayed as having an unfavorable view of how his predecessors dealt with the Prophet's estates, but the negative characterization of his views are censored or amended in the collection of Bukhari to say that Ali claimed this and that. Ali claimed kada wa kada about the first two caliphs when Al-Bukhari narrates the report. So what are we learning from these examples? Lesson number 7 is the following, that there was a large editorial enterprise at work in the maintenance of orthodoxy. Copyists and scholars sometimes used certain tools to shape the literature they transmitted in ways that agreed with their sensibilities. And I'd say lesson number 8 is that large Sunni hadith collections like the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, the Musnad of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or the Mu'jam of Tabarani, where you have upwards of 10, 20, 30,000 hadith, will be very diverse in their sources. You can find contributions from those who are pro-3 caliph, those who are pro-Umayyad, those who are pro-Ali, and those who are somewhere in the middle, those who are centrists. It's a mixed bag that preserves the beliefs of all of these factions. It's in biographical dictionaries, and in these collections, we can best see how the views of early antagonists to Ali are partially erased, but also partially endure in Islamic literature until today. These are some of the lessons I hope readers can draw from the book. Thank you.